It's March 30th, 1981. Ronald Reagan has been president for 69 days and is making his way to his limo after giving a speech at the Washington Hilton Hotel. Near the limo stands John Hinckley Jr., a man trying to garner the affections of actress Jodie Foster with a .22 caliber rifle. This moment was seemingly perpetuating an eerie pattern that had been affecting United States presidents for nearly a century and a half. A pattern that believers in the supernatural think may have begun in the early 19th century. In 1811, the American Indian chief Tecumseh assembled a group of warriors in opposition to the Fort Wayne Treaty, an agreement between the United States and 6 different tribes that saw 3 million acres of land transferred from the tribes to the Americans. This treaty was brokered by William Henry Harrison. When Tecumseh and his half-brother, Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, resisted the treaty, it was William Henry Harrison who assembled his own force, 1,000 soldiers, hoping to intimidate Tecumseh's Shawnee into making peace. That's not what happened. Tecumseh launched a surprise attack in Prophetstown next to the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers. The battle would be remembered as the Battle of Tippecanoe, and after leading a successful defense, William Henry Harrison would become a national figure and would be nicknamed Old Tippecanoe. Tecumseh and Harrison would meet again in the Battle of the Thames. This time, Tecumseh would lose his life on the battlefield. Legend has it that the prophet Tenskwatawa decided to seek a supernatural revenge on Harrison. He said, "Harrison will die, I tell you, and after him, every great chief chosen every 20 years thereafter will die." Harrison was elected president in 1840. His inauguration day, March 4th, 1841, was a dreadfully cold and wet day in the nation's capital. Despite that, the 68-year-old Harrison decided he needed to show his virility and rode in on horseback, foregoing the traditional carriage. He then delivered what still stands today as the longest inaugural address, orating 8,445 words over the span of 2 cold, wet hours. His show of virility would be his downfall. He immediately began to feel ill, and 22 days after being sworn in, developed a terrible fever. 9 days after that, he succumbed to pneumonia. And just like that, a month after being sworn in, William Henry Harrison became the first president to die while in office. Tensions were high in the United States, but an election had to happen nonetheless. The North coalesced behind Abraham Lincoln, and he was able to beat a crowded field in the Electoral College, making him the 16th president. On March 4th, 1865, with the Civil War that had raged throughout his first term winding down, Lincoln was inaugurated for the second time. A little more than a month later, on April 14, 1865, Abe sat down to take in the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. John Wilkes Booth entered Lincoln's balcony, and when the audience erupted in laughter and applause, shot Lincoln in the back of the head. He died later that day. In the election of 1880, James Garfield defeated Winfield Scott Hancock to become the 20th president of the United States. 4 months after being inaugurated, President Garfield was at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C., on his way to attend his 26th college reunion. A gunman shot Garfield twice. 2 months later, he became the 3rd straight president, elected in a year ending in 0, to die in office. The first election of the 20th century was a rematch of the last election of the 19th, but the winning ticket was slightly different. The incumbent president, William McKinley's vice president, Garrett Hobart, had died a year earlier, requiring McKinley to appoint a new running mate. He chose the 42-year-old Theodore Roosevelt. Just 6 months after being inaugurated as the second youngest vice president, Roosevelt would become America's youngest president. President William McKinley was attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. While shaking hands with attendees in the Temple of Music, he was shot twice in the abdomen by an anarchist. He succumbed to his wounds 8 days later. (1920) was the first presidential election in which women had the right to vote in all 48 states. Warren Harding won with a popular vote margin of 26.2%, which remains the biggest margin in American history. 2 years into his first term, on August 2, 1923, Harding was recovering from pneumonia. His wife Florence was reading him an article from the Saturday Evening Post when Harding suddenly convulsed and died of a major heart attack. 5 straight presidents elected in a year ending in 0 had died in office. "1940 was unprecedented. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was running for and won a 3rd term in office under the cloud of an impending Second World War. Roosevelt saw out the entire term and ran for and won a 4th term in 1944. The financial crisis and war that raged throughout his entire presidency aged the longest tenured president beyond recognition. When he returned from the Yalta Conference in 1945, many were shocked at how old, thin, and frail FDR appeared. On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt slumped forward in his chair, unconscious, and died of a massive intracerebral hemorrhage at the age of 63. The election of 1960 was the closest since 1916 and saw John F. Kennedy become the youngest president ever elected, despite winning 4 fewer states than his opponent, Richard Nixon. 3 years after his election, on November 22, 1963, Kennedy was riding through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, in an open-top car. At 12:30 p.m., 2 bullets struck the 46-year-old president, one in the back, exiting via his throat, and the other in the head. 30 minutes later, Kennedy died. "1840, 1860, 1880, 1900, 1920, 1940, 1960. At this point, it seemed that whoever was elected in 1980 was doomed by the curse of Tippecanoe. The incumbent, Jimmy Carter, damaged by escalating tensions with Iran and a sluggish economy, was absolutely destroyed at the ballot box, only winning 6 states, ushering in Ronald Reagan as president. Reagan had been in office for 2 months. He had just given a speech at the Washington Hilton Hotel and was returning to his limousine. Suddenly, shots rang out, and Reagan was struck in the chest. He was rushed to George Washington University Hospital, nearing death from his internal injuries. The curse seemed to be taking hold again. But in the emergency room, doctors were able to stabilize the president. Reagan was able to recover and saw out the remainder of his term, becoming the first president since James Monroe to be elected in a year ending in 0 and survive. The 2000 election was a mess. Despite losing the popular vote by roughly 500,000, George W. Bush was determined to have won the tipping point state of Florida by a mere 537 votes and was declared president-elect. In 2004, Bush was re-elected as president. In 2005, he was giving a speech in the Freedom Square in Tbilisi, Georgia. When he began speaking, a Soviet-made RGD-5 hand grenade, wrapped in a red tartan handkerchief, was thrown toward the podium. The grenade landed a mere 61 feet from the President of the United States, roughly the same distance a pitcher's mound is from home plate on a baseball field. The pin was pulled. It was live. It should have gone off and at the very least injured President Bush, but it didn't. The red handkerchief remained wrapped around the grenade, preventing the striker lever from releasing. Bush escaped uninjured. A legitimate attempt had been made on his life, but he was able to see out his term. Maybe this is all coincidental. The reality is that presidents have their lives threatened far too often, so it makes sense that occasionally assassinations happen. Presidents also skew older and have one of the most stressful jobs imaginable, so it's not really surprising that they sometimes succumb to poor health. But consider this for a second. 8 presidents have died in office. Of those 8, 7 were elected in a year that ends in 0. The only exception is Zachary Taylor, who was elected in 1848, but President Taylor died in 1850. Maybe Ronald Reagan broke the curse. Maybe modern medicine broke the curse. Maybe curses aren't real, and this is all coincidental. But if Tenskwatawa truly attempted to curse William Henry Harrison, and have he and every great chief chosen every 20 years die, then it's safe to say he was successful. The next election in this 20-year cycle is in 2020. 4 of the frontrunners are in their 70s, and each of them would be the oldest president ever elected. one can only hope that either the curse has been broken, or, more likely, that curses do not exist.